If someone had told me years ago that my own sister would ruin my engagement and later come to me for help after losing everything, I would have laughed it off. But that's exactly where life led us. My name is Clara Bennett, and this is the story of how the person I trusted most turned my world upside down. It didn't happen all at once. The first cracks appeared long before anyone noticed. Growing up in Charleston, I was the quiet daughter who followed the rules, while my older sister Haley learned how to bend them until they broke. She had a charm that could disarm anyone, especially my father. Robert Bennett always claimed to value fairness, but somehow Haley always managed to bask in his attention. He'd say, "She just knows how to make things happen." I always wondered if that was his way of saying I wasn't enough. When I stayed up late to study, he said nothing. But when Haley wanted to sing at a local festival, he called the whole family to watch. For years, I tried to believe that her success didn't have to mean my failure, but every comparison wore down my patience. Every compliment for her dimmed what little pride I had left. When I finally earned a college scholarship, Dad said, "Finally, one of you is figuring it out." I wanted to feel proud, but all I heard was relief. The day I left Charleston, Haley hugged me and said, "Don't forget who loves you most." I didn't realize she meant herself, and I never imagined she'd one day take everything from me, even the man I was supposed to marry. If you've ever trusted someone who used that trust to hurt you, stay with me. This story might sound painfully familiar. Years later, I returned home, not as the quiet girl I'd been, but as a woman who thought she'd finally built a life of her own. After years working in New York, I came back to Charleston to help Dad fix up the old house by the bay. The place had aged, but so had I, and that symmetry made the air feel different. Dad still carried himself with the same quiet pride. When he saw me step out of the car, he smiled and said, "You look like you've seen the world, Clara." I told him I was just glad to be home, though I wasn't sure if that was true. The repairs took longer than planned, and that's how I met my fiancé, Ethan Miller. He worked with the architectural team on the renovation, and from our first conversation, he had a calmness that drew people in. Ethan was patient and thoughtful, the kind of man who made silence feel comfortable. When he talked about his work, his eyes held a steady confidence I'd always searched for. I started looking forward to his visits, and so did Dad, who appreciated how Ethan listened to his endless stories about building houses by hand. Slowly, evenings at home felt less lonely. A year later, Ethan proposed on the front porch of that same house. Dad stood nearby, and when I said yes, he smiled with quiet satisfaction. "You finally found someone who sees you," he said. I felt something shift inside me. A piece I hadn't known was missing. For the first time, I believed happiness could last. That illusion began to fade when Haley showed up, saying she wanted to help with the wedding. Her sudden enthusiasm felt rehearsed, but she'd always known how to play the caring sister. Dad welcomed her warmly, maybe hoping for reconciliation, while I hesitated to question her motives. Haley insisted on helping with the flowers, the music, and the guest list. At first, I thought her attention to detail was genuine, but soon I noticed how often her focus drifted to Ethan. She praised him in front of everyone, calling him charming and kind, her tone soft and lingering. During the cake tasting, she laughed too loudly at his jokes, resting her hand on his arm as if it was the most natural thing in the world. My stomach tightened each time, but I told myself families are complicated and that I was just being paranoid. I'd spent most of my life comparing myself to her shadow, and I refused to believe she'd crossed that line. One evening, as the sun set over the water, I went outside to check the porch lights. That's when I saw them standing close together, their voices low, their laughter easy. Haley touched his shoulder as she whispered something, and Ethan didn't move away. The scene looked innocent enough, but something inside me froze. When I walked up, Haley turned first and smiled. "We were just talking about the ceremony," she said lightly. Ethan nodded, his expression calm. "She's just trying to help," he added. I wanted to believe him, because the alternative was too painful. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the way they looked at each other, and their laughter echoed in my mind like a whisper I couldn't silence. A few months before the wedding, small cracks began to show. Hairline fractures I tried to ignore until they grew too wide to hide. Ethan started working late, saying he and Haley were finalizing wedding details. I wanted to trust him. He spoke casually about it, saying Haley had good taste and her help was saving us time. Still, every time he mentioned her name, something heavy settled in my chest. The thought of them together, sharing ideas I wasn't part of, made my hands shake. One evening, Ethan left his phone on the kitchen counter. The screen lit up with a message from Haley, a simple note about the seating chart, followed by a red heart. I stared at it for several seconds, my breath growing uneven. When he came back, I asked calmly, "Why is she sending you hearts now?" He smiled like it was nothing. "She cares about you, he said, brushing my hair behind my ear. The gesture felt rehearsed. I nodded, pretending to accept it, though my chest felt tight with disbelief and shame. I'd promised myself I'd never be the kind of woman who doubted her partner. Yet that night, I kept thinking about how easily lies can sound like comfort when spoken softly enough. In the days that followed, Ethan grew distant. He stopped asking about my day, and conversations that once felt natural became forced. Dad noticed the change before I could hide it. One morning, while we painted the porch railings, he said quietly, "Don't let anyone decide your worth." I turned to him, surprised, but he didn't look up. His tone was gentle and tired, as if he'd learned the same lesson too late. His words stayed with me long after he went inside. When Dad's birthday came, I tried to bring back the warmth we'd lost. We hosted a small dinner, inviting only a few close friends. Haley arrived dressed elegantly, carrying a bottle of wine. She moved through the room like she belonged there more than I did. Ethan greeted her with a hug that lasted just a little too long, though no one else seemed to notice. As the night went on, Haley drank more than usual, her laughter louder, her hands more careless. I watched her lean against Ethan's shoulder as she laughed at something he whispered. My heart pounded, so hard I had to step outside for air. The laughter from inside followed me through the window, sharp and bright like broken glass. The next morning, the smell of coffee filled the kitchen. Ethan was already gone, saying he had errands to run. I walked to the driveway where his car sat under the oak tree. As I reached for my bag in the passenger seat, something glinted against the dark fabric, a delicate gold bracelet, the one Haley wore the night before. My fingers froze around it. For a long time, I just stood there listening to the quiet hum of the street. I slipped the bracelet into my pocket and walked back inside without a word. I didn't confront Ethan, not yet. Sometimes I realized silence reveals more than questions ever could. 2 weeks later, the silence was heavier than any argument. It filled every room, pressing against the walls, settling in the corners of our unfinished home. Ethan had stopped talking about the wedding. His phone calls came more often, but he always took them outside, his voice low and clipped. When I asked if everything was all right, he nodded too quickly, his smile stretched thin. I told myself stress could make anyone distant, that love just needed patience. But deep down, I knew patience wouldn't save us this time. Haley vanished without a word. One morning, she simply stopped coming by, and no one seemed to know where she'd gone. Dad mentioned she'd called once, but wouldn't say much. Her absence should have been a relief, but it only made the air feel emptier. I noticed how Ethan avoided her name, as if saying it might summon something we both feared. The nights grew longer, and I started to dread the silence between us more than the sound of lies. One evening, after dinner, I finally asked, "Is there something you're not telling me?" My voice was calm, almost detached. Ethan froze, his hand still on the counter. For a long moment, he didn't speak. Then, with a quiet sigh, he said, "Haley is pregnant." The words felt unreal, hanging between us. I waited for him to say more, to tell me it wasn't his, but his next words cut through everything. "The baby might be mine." The room spun. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I just stood there, numb, my heart pounding with the sound of something breaking in perfect silence. Ethan tried to reach for me, but I stepped back before he could touch me. "I need air," I said softly. I grabbed my keys and walked out without looking back. I drove to Folly Beach, the road lit only by the moon. The ocean was calm, a wide mirror of silver beneath the night sky. I sat in the car for a while before walking barefoot to the water's edge. The wind was cold, biting at my skin, but it felt cleaner than the house I'd left. I didn't cry. There was no energy left for that. I just stood there and let the wind strip away what was left of my pride. Somewhere behind me, a car pulled up. My best friend Jenna was the only one who didn't ask questions. She just showed up. She walked beside me in silence until the tide reached our feet. Then she said quietly, "No one can take your dignity unless you hand it over." Her voice carried a strength that made the world seem less cruel. I wanted to believe her, but all I could feel was the hollow ache of betrayal. When the sun rose, I drove back to Dad's house. The morning light poured through the kitchen windows, soft and forgiving. Dad was waiting outside, sitting on the porch steps. He didn't ask where I'd been. When I stopped in front of him, he stood and opened his arms. I let him hold me, and for the first time in weeks, I allowed myself to breathe. "Time has a way of fixing what people destroy," he said. His voice trembled, but his embrace was steady. I wanted to believe him, though I knew time couldn't mend everything. As I stood there watching the horizon glow with the first light of day, I realized there was nothing left to protect. The truth had already done its work. Haley's silence had meaning now, and Ethan's guilt no longer needed proof. What remained was only the echo of what we once were, two sisters separated by choices that could never be undone. 8 months later, I returned for one reason, to face what was left. Charleston looked the same, but nothing about it felt familiar. The salt air that once smelled like comfort now carried memories I'd rather forget. I'd built a quiet life in another city, far from the whispers and the pity. Yet coming home felt inevitable. When I arrived at Dad's house, the porch light was still flickering as if time refused to move on, even when people did. Dad said he wanted to have dinner together. His voice on the phone was steady, but heavy. He said it would be a family evening, though he didn't say who else would be there. I already knew. That night, as I walked into the dining room, seeing Haley sitting across from Ethan made my stomach twist. She looked thinner, her eyes tired but defiant. Ethan, on the other hand, seemed unchanged, calm, polished, the same man who once swore I was his future. Dad sat at the head of the table, silent, his hands clasped. Dinner began without words. The clinking of silverware filled the room, an orchestra of avoidance. I could feel Dad's gaze moving between us, measuring the distance, the damage. Finally, he set down his fork and looked straight at Haley. His voice was low but firm. "Tell her the truth." Haley's hand trembled as she put down her glass. For a moment, she seemed to shrink under the weight of those words. Then, in a voice that sounded rehearsed, she whispered, "The baby is Ethan's." The words hung in the air like smoke. My breath caught, though I'd known it long before hearing it aloud. Knowing and accepting are different things, and her confession made it real in a way silence never could. Ethan leaned back in his chair. "It was a mistake," he said, his voice flat, almost casual. There was no apology, no guilt. His eyes didn't search for mine because he already knew what he'd find. There was nothing left to save. For years, I'd imagined how the truth might sound, but I never thought it would be this empty. Dad stood slowly. His expression was unreadable, but his voice was cold. "You've disgraced this family," he said to Haley. "You've broken trust in ways that can't be repaired. From this day on, you're no longer my daughter." Haley's face drained of color. She tried to speak, but the words tangled in her throat. Dad continued, his tone final. "You'll be removed from my will. Whatever I leave will go to the one who still remembers what loyalty means." His gaze shifted to me, but I couldn't meet it. There was no victory in being the one left standing. I rose from my seat. The chair scraped softly against the floor, the only sound in the quiet that followed. I looked at Ethan first, then Haley, her eyes filled with tears she hadn't earned. "I'm done." My words were steady but hollow. I didn't wait for a response. I walked out of the house, past the porch lights still flickering in the dark, and into the night air that smelled like rain. Outside, I stopped by the garden gate where I used to stand as a child. The sound of crickets filled the silence. Behind me, voices rose, Haley pleading, Dad unmoved, Ethan silent. I didn't turn back. Some endings don't need closure. They only need distance. I walked away knowing forgiveness was a luxury I could never afford again. The past had already taken enough. A year later, Dad was gone, and the silence in the house felt permanent. The phone call came just before dawn, the kind that splits your world into before and after. The doctor said it was a stroke, quick and merciless. I listened, gripping the counter, staring at the half-finished cup of coffee that would never be his again. The words made sense, but my mind refused to accept them. When I finally reached Charleston, the house stood still, its quiet heavier than grief. The funeral passed in a blur. Faces came and went, offering condolences I could barely hear. I moved through the motions, shaking hands, accepting flowers, pretending composure could replace mourning. I didn't cry. It wasn't that I didn't feel loss. It was that I'd spent years preparing for it without knowing. Haley never came. There was no call, no letter, not even her name in the condolence book. For the first time, her absence didn't hurt. It simply confirmed what I already knew. Our family had ended long before death arrived. A week later, Dad's attorney handed me an envelope sealed in wax, written in his familiar handwriting, the kind that leaned slightly to the right, as if in a hurry to speak. Inside was a letter and the will. I sat on the porch where he used to read every morning, listening to the wind in the oak trees. His words began simply, "My daughter, if you're reading this, I'm at peace." I could almost hear his voice as I read on. He wrote about forgiveness, about how time reveals who stands when everything else falls. Then came the line that stayed with me. Justice is not revenge, it's peace. He left everything to me. The house, the land, the savings, all valued at $5 million. The lawyer's tone was respectful, but even he couldn't hide his surprise. I signed the papers with hands that felt detached from the rest of me. Inheriting wealth from a man who taught me the value of silence felt strange, like holding light after years of darkness. It wasn't triumph. It was the weight of legacy pressing on my chest. The days that followed were quiet. I cleaned the rooms one by one, opening windows that hadn't been touched in months. Dust rose like ghosts from the floorboards, settling again in thin layers of memory. I found Dad's watch on his bedside table, still ticking faintly, and placed it in my pocket as if carrying time itself might make the loss less final. Each evening I sat on the porch, watching the horizon fade into the river, wondering what he meant by peace. Haley's name never crossed my mind during those days. I didn't expect her to show up for the funeral, and I didn't wish she had. She had made her choice, and Dad had made his. The house, once filled with tension, now felt like an echo chamber of things unsaid. It was strange to live surrounded by walls that had witnessed every argument, every silence, every act of love that tried and failed to save us. One night, as I sorted through Dad's belongings, I found the envelope he'd addressed to the executor of the estate. It confirmed what I already knew. Every asset had been transferred to my name. Beneath it was another envelope, this one stamped by the county court, dated only a week before. I frowned, setting it aside at first, thinking it was just unfinished paperwork. But as I turned off the light and looked back at the pile of documents, the thought nagged at me. Something about the seal looked too new, too deliberate, like it was waiting to be opened. I sat down, the room dim except for the desk lamp. My fingers hesitated before breaking the seal. Inside was a single sheet of paper from the Charleston County Court. The words at the top froze me. Notice of legal claim. For a moment, I didn't breathe. Beneath it, written in bold, was a name I'd spent a year trying to forget, Haley Bennett. It began with a letter from the Charleston court, a name I never wanted to see again. The paper trembled in my hands, as if it understood the weight it carried. Inside was the notice I'd feared without ever expecting. My sister Haley was suing me. My attorney told me not to take it personally, but how could I not? When my own sister claimed I'd manipulated our father into leaving her nothing. The words sounded absurd, yet they cut deeper than any truth ever could. The morning of the first hearing, the courthouse loomed like a monument to everything broken between us. My attorney, calm and collected, reminded me to speak only when addressed, to let the documents speak for themselves. He believed emotion would only play into Haley's performance. I nodded, clutching the leather folder that held every piece of proof. Dad's will, the doctor's notes, the witness signatures. Yet, even with evidence, my chest felt heavy. Justice, I remembered Dad writing, was not revenge, but peace. Still, peace felt distant in a room built for judgment. Haley entered late. Her hair was carefully styled, her eyes red, but not from tears I trusted. She glanced at me once before sitting beside her lawyer, a man who looked practiced in empathy. The judge, a stern woman in her 60s, began by outlining Haley's claims that I had isolated Dad, influenced his decisions, and coerced him during the drafting of the will. The words filled the air like smoke, hard to breathe, impossible to clear. My attorney stood and responded with precision. He presented medical records showing Dad's cognitive health was fully intact at the time of signing. The attending physician's report confirmed no sign of dementia or impairment. Then came the testimony of Mr. Lell, the family's longtime notary, who witnessed Dad reading every page before signing, insisting his intentions were firm and fair. I sat still as the statements were read aloud, watching Haley's composure begin to crack. When it was her turn, Haley rose with trembling hands. Her voice quivered as she spoke of a childhood filled with favoritism and silence. She said, "I was always the one who could do no wrong, that I inherited love while she inherited absence." Her words echoed in the courtroom, crafted to sound fragile, almost innocent. I wanted to feel something, anger, pity, even nostalgia, but there was only exhaustion. Every accusation felt like a mirror turned backward, reflecting a story she'd rewritten to survive her own guilt. The judge listened, unmoved, asking for documentation to support Haley's claims. None existed. Her lawyer tried to steer the argument toward emotion, but the evidence outweighed sentiment. My attorney placed the doctor's certification and the notarized will on the desk. The judge read them carefully, then looked up. "There is no indication of coercion," she said. "The decedent was of sound mind. The will stands as written." The sound of the gavel striking would felt like the end of a long storm. My attorney exhaled softly, gathering the documents. I looked toward Haley, whose face had gone pale, her lips trembling as if she'd expected a different kind of mercy. She stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor, and shouted, "You took everything from me." The words echoed through the courtroom, hollow yet sharp. For a second, I thought of the nights we shared a room as children, whispering dreams into the dark, promising we'd always protect each other. But that version of us no longer existed. I stood, not to respond, but to leave. There was nothing left to say that wouldn't reopen wounds already cauterized by truth. Outside, the Charleston sun burned bright and indifferent. My attorney walked beside me, silent, until we reached the courthouse steps. "You did the right thing," he said finally. I nodded, though the victory felt weightless. Justice had been served, but peace, the kind Dad spoke of, still lingered out of reach, somewhere beyond the walls of law and memory. Haley's world, I later heard, had begun to fall apart piece by piece. After the trial, her employer let her go, citing loss of trust. Friends who once admired her stopped returning her calls, unwilling to be caught in the fallout. She sold her jewelry to pay rent, then the car, then whatever was left of her pride. Ethan, unable to bear the weight of her bitterness and the child he never truly wanted, left town quietly one morning, leaving behind a note and half a promise to send money that never came. I never rejoiced in their ruin, but I couldn't pretend to grieve for it either. In the stillness that followed, I began to see what rebuilding could look like. With a portion of the inheritance, I bought back Dad's old house, the one that had once held every argument and reconciliation we ever shared. But instead of restoring it to what it had been, I turned it into a shelter for children with nowhere else to go. I filled it with laughter, new paint, and the sound of lives just beginning. Every time I walked through its halls, I felt a kind of peace that words couldn't contain, something between forgiveness and release. One morning, as I sorted through the week's mail, I found a letter with no return address. The handwriting stopped me cold. It was Haley's. The paper was creased, the ink faint in places. as though it had been written through hesitation. I opened it slowly, unsure what I was ready to find. Inside, in just a few lines, she wrote, "I finally understand what peace costs. I hope someday you can believe I'm trying to find mine." I folded the letter and placed it beside Dad's photograph on the mantel. He was smiling in that way he used to when silence said enough. I stepped outside to the porch, where the sea wind brushed my face and let the horizon fill my view. The past no longer pulled at me. It simply existed, like an old scar that no longer ached. I realized then that sometimes victory doesn't mean watching someone lose. It means reclaiming the part of yourself you thought was gone forever. Justice doesn't always come with applause. Sometimes it's the quiet courage to let go and rebuild yourself after everything has fallen apart. It's learning that forgiveness isn't weakness, but strength in its most human form. Peace isn't found in punishment or revenge. It lives in the decision to rise again. Forgiveness isn't about them. It's about freeing your own heart and choosing to live without carrying the weight of what broke you. Thank you for staying with me until the end of my story. If it reminded you of your own strength or helped you breathe a little easier, share your thoughts in the comments. I read every one. And if you believe stories can heal, that truth can bring light back into the darkest rooms, please subscribe and stay with us for more.